Mega Man Network Transmission is my favorite game to die for, but I can't say it's a good game. Stick with me and that sentence will make some sense. The Mega Man franchise started in the 80s with platforming games. These were pretty standard run-and-gun action that are remembered to this day because they were really fun and well-designed games. In 2001, the Blue Bomber deviated further from jumping and shooting than ever before with the release of Mega Man Battle Network, a massive shift into a real-time, turn-based, tactical action card battling RPG. And now, with 20 years of legacy, these strategic adventures of the Azure program are renowned in just the same way as those vintage outings for the sky-colored robot. But what is fascinating is that 2 years after the original Battle Network, we got Mega Man Network Transmission, a game that asked us, what if Battle Network, the RPG, was another run-and-gun platformer? Plenty of game franchises spin off into new genres, but very few of those continue to spin full circle, Ouroborosing back into the genre of their genesis. Network Transmission is like if Nintendo decided that Mario Kart 8 was so popular that the Switch's plumber platformer would be Super Mario Kart Odyssey, where you couldn't run around on foot. It's the translation of a phrase into a new tongue, and then the decrypting of those new words back to the source language. Which is to say that Mega Man Network Transmission is a game that I love to death, but I can't claim that it's a good game, at least not objectively. But in the same way that the translation I opened with was way more interest-piquing and fun than that thesis, I would argue that Network Transmission is a fun game that deserves to be remembered, and it's worth looking at with new eyes. So this is it. Capcom's big official GameCube attempt to marry the gameplay styles of the classic Super Fighting Robot and the more modern Super Fighting Smartphone. And the gameplay is basically a pretty straightforward Mega Man platformer where you're jumping and shooting just like you'd expect. The controls feel snappy and the game feel is nice, though the dubious graphics style sometimes makes things a little iffy. The Battle Network components come in the form of battle chips, replacing the typical weapons you'd get from sending Robot Masters to the scrap heap in classic Mega Man. It's neat that you can get a weapon from almost every enemy in the game instead of just the big bads, though this does carry some issues with it that we'll talk about in a bit. Just like in Battle Network, you have a custom gauge that fills up as you play, and when it's full, you can choose up to 5 battle chips out of a random selection from your folder. This doesn't quite work, because after I take down one enemy, I can just stand here and do nothing until the gauge refills. So you kinda can always have whatever options you want, it's just annoying to wait and cycle until you get them. And the game does need some failsafe in place along these lines to account for the on-the-fly weapon switching this style of game was designed around all those decades ago. Like, imagine playing classic Mega Man and being stuck with the wrong random special weapons. Here's
insert Mega Man 2 boss,
but you rolled
non-metal blade weapon.
Better luck next time. It's just that the mechanic could be cleaner, like if there were certain points in the level that let you pick new chips, or you got a certain number of custom gauge charges to use per area. And this is emblematic of what is pretty much the problem with this game. I have no source backing this up as fact, but plenty of the mechanics the game is built on feel like they were someone's first idea, and no time was given to iterate or refine them further. Which, when you look at how many Mega Man games came out between 2000 and 2006, very well may have been true due to their schedule. Plus, I really can't imagine the budget for this one was too impressive. So, because of this, the general opinion of Network Transmission is not amazing. And the biggest strike against it is the pretty brutal difficulty curve and the poor first impression that comes with that. Fireman, the first boss, is the perfect display of this. You get to him having used up a lot of the ammo for your battle chips to fight through the stage, and then the boss fight begins and he can kill you in like 4 hits. And none of his attacks are easy to dodge. In almost any other Mega Man game, the first boss might be tough, but it's not like this. And it's a gosh dang shame too, because while this certainly could have been designed better, I think it's ultimately an issue of conveyance. The game doesn't explain itself well enough to earn a new player's patience for dealing with this nonsense. See, the game gives you pretty easy access to Bubbler at this point, and Fireman is weak to it. Like, now he goes down in 4 hits level of weak to it. That's a Metal Blade tier weapon that you have available immediately. And it's definitely not a free fight even with that, but when you think of this as maybe the only classic-style Mega Man game that gives you the first boss's weakness before you fight them, it just feels like a huge misstep that its lasting reputation is one of an impossible opening. Something as simple as some dialogue before the fight or after your first loss suggesting getting copies of a water chip to use on Old Fiery would do a lot towards solving the problem. It's a band-aid solution, but it's a pretty cool band-aid. To me, an important part of this game is that the bosses are meant to be different from typical Mega Man platformers. In the classic games, boss fights are more akin to soccer or basketball games. They're longer fights with back and forth, pattern recognition, and an element of endurance to decide a victor. In Network Transmission, the bosses are cage matches. The characters appear bigger on screen, and the space you fight in is smaller and more restrictive. 2 programs enter, 1 program leaves, and you're trying to burn each other to the ground fast. This feels to me like a reference to how strongly Battle Network emphasized speed in winning fights, and I think that's pretty cool. A lot of the interpretations of EXE mechanics are pretty jank, like the custom gauge I mentioned before. Chips also have multiple uses, but you have to manually farm copies of them to get the max number of uses. It feels clumsy, unnecessary, and often like kind of a waste of time. On top of that, this green bar is the MP bar. Not like Final Fantasy, it means memory this time. Using any chip consumes some of this, with stronger chips using more memory. But this is another clunky mechanic that tends to incentivize waiting before advancing so the bar has more time to fill back up, or just relying on the buster. It's that running with the first idea energy I was talking about. As it is, I often prefer weaker chips because I'm allowed to have more uses of them and am less limited by their MP cost. But this doesn't ruin the game by any means, and really small changes could solve it. I feel like the game would work better by removing the bar and limits on chip use and instead just giving each chip a specific internal cooldown timer. Or maybe everything could just run on generic chip energy like the weapon energy power-ups in classic Mega Man, because it is really annoying to spend limited chip uses on infinitely respawning enemies, or to farm specific chips like in Viz from viruses that have multiple potential drops. And overall, my absolute favorite part of Network Transmission is how it integrates the RPG elements into a classic Mega Man skeleton, even if there are some missteps in the specifics. As much as I'm criticizing the details, I do think these elements overall make the game what it is, and I have a lot of fun with them. This game uses the Mystery Data system from the Battle Network series, but most of the rare and unique goodies are hidden behind tough platforming sections, cleverly hidden secrets, or a solid understanding of the game mechanics. It does a great job of translating RPG exploration and growth into the platforming genre. Overcoming a tricky challenge and being rewarded with a buster power-up instead of just the ability to continue moving forward is so rewarding. It reminds me a lot of looking for armor pieces and sub-tanks in Mega Man X, but there's just so much more cool stuff to collect that it's extra enjoyable. Some of the more overworldy platforming zones, like Den Area specifically, have so much out-of-the-way stuff to explore that I think the optional areas are actually bigger than the parts you have to go through. Unlike some game elements, such as grinding out max copies of a chip, revisiting areas for treasure never feels like a grind. You always get stuff that's actually worth it, and seeking it out is a highlight of the game for me. Plus, it shines a spotlight on the game's level design, which I think is actually quite strong. There are a couple levels with really annoying parts, Quickman's lasers and some of the spikes and platforming in Needleman stage come to mind, but thankfully the battle chip system does a ton to mitigate problems like this with solutions such as Invis or Double Jump. Now, the game's story is nothing to write home about. It takes place between the first 2 Battle Networks despite coming out after the second one, and none of the games actually reference Network Transmission's events, meaning this one somehow has a less consequential plot than even Battle Network 4. There's a dangerous Zero virus around the net, and now these keep getting hacked and going berserk, so you've got to stop them. Thankfully, jumping and shooting for its own merit is more than enough to draw me in. And I have to admit, it's cool to see Mega Man X characters and ideas represented in the Battle Network timeline for the first time. Even if Zero himself kinda looks like a shoddy straight-to-DVD adaptation compared to the original perfect character design. Fun fact, originally this said Netflix adaptation, but then the Scott Pilgrim thing looks pretty good. In general, visually, the game is kind of a mixed bag. I love cel-shaded graphics, but a lot of these just look off, or indistinct at best. A lot of the stages have super cool aesthetics though, and all of the 2D art for character portraits and battleships is spot on. Starman honestly makes a claim for the best Navi design in the entire series, and the soundtrack is just an absolute delight. I've been using songs and remixes from this game for the whole video, and I know you're vibing with it. So this probably feels like a weird review. I've stated my feelings to actually be positive, but most of what I've been talking about has been defensively addressing the game's flaws and qualifying my takes more than explaining them. And that's because this game is just a bit off, like a questionable Google translation. But in the same way that a chain of translations can create thoughts that are somehow more poetic and fun than perfectly spoken English, as rough as this game is around the edges, everything sometimes aligns in phase and you can tell how great a Mega Man.exe platformer could be. And in order to appreciate this game, you have to understand its quirks and missteps as well as its ambitions and successes, and reconcile those in some deep core part of your brain. There are flashes where network transmission feels just as good, if not better, than either of the Mega Man franchises that it's built upon. And to experience that, I think it's completely worth wasting 2 or 3 minutes sometimes to draw the Navi chips you need for a boss fight, or struggling to grind copies of Canon and Zenny for power power-ups in the early game. There is true platforming bliss to be found once you figure out a rhythm of charging your buster, dodging virus attacks, and figuring out which battle chips you like and when and where to use them. In conclusion, I leave you with this. Mega Man Network Transmission will not be the greatest game you ever play. It will not be your favorite Mega Man platformer or your favorite game starring Mega Man.exe. But it might just be the best game you ever play while watching Bob's Burgers or Futurama in the background. Which honestly solves some of the game's major issues, like having to wait around. And that's just the kind of game this is. Certainly lacking polish and finesse, but it's got a comfy atmosphere and engaging enough gameplay to just feel nice to relax with in your own space on your own terms. If you like Battle Network, and especially if you like all walks of Mega Man, maybe it's time to give this game a first or second chance. Let me know down below how you feel about Mega Man Network Transmission, and if you agree or disagree or think anything I said was interesting, stupid, or inspiring. I'll be back soon with even more content for you, and I'm sorry this one took so long. Thanks for watching, mash the subscribe button, until then.